Welcome everyone to this Sociological Review event. It's the second of two podcasting for sociologists webinars. Today, we're offering you the inside story on how to get media coverage for your podcast. As anyone who has a podcast knows, that's a very important part of the picture. But first, I'd like to say a few words about the Sociological Review. Many of you will know of the Sociological Review Journal, which is the UK's oldest sociology peer-reviewed journal. But there's more to us than that. The Sociological Review Foundation is a registered charity, and the purpose is to advance the education of the public on the subject of sociology and related disciplines. Our core work includes supporting early career scholars, promoting sociological thinking to audiences beyond academia, raising awareness of key debates that shape society, and directing and supporting projects that directly intervene in emerging issues. We have a lot of initiatives that extend beyond the journal. They include funding for seminar series. We have a call running right now. Running writing retreats. There's also a call open at the moment for early career scholars in the UK. We offer an annual Sociological Review Fellowship, and we present an annual lecture, and there'll be some news about that very soon. We publish an open access digital magazine aimed at a broad readership, and we also publish sociological fiction, book reviews, and we have a great monthly image maker in residence on the visual sociology end of things. And of course, as the subject of this webinar would suggest, we bring you sociologically minded podcasts. Our flagship series, Uncommon Sense, is now in its second year. If you'd like to stay up to date on our news, calls, and opportunities, please follow us on social media, visit our website at thesociologicalreview.org, and sign up to our monthly newsletter. I'll put the link in the chat box later on. But back to today's event, and thank you again for joining us today. This masterclass will run for about 75 minutes and will include a question and answer session at the end. We have a large group today, so in order to ensure that our speakers get to as many of your questions as possible, we'd ask that you type them into the chat box. One more thing regarding the chat box, we were talking just before the event went live and suggested that what we'd love to hear from you in the chat box is whether if you have a podcast, share us the name and a link. And if you haven't got a podcast yet, but are thinking of making one, maybe just tell us briefly what you're looking at focusing on. We'd love to know more about great podcasts focusing on sociology and other social sciences. So don't hide your light under a bushel. Please let us know in the chat box what your podcast is. So our speakers today, as you will know, are Professor Michaela Benson. I'm gesturing to her little stamp-sized picture right there, and journalist Fiona Sturges. We're delighted that they're both with us. They'll be talking about the podcasting landscape and where it's going, their thoughts on that, what makes a podcast valuable and compelling, both to listeners and to journalists, as you would guess from the title of today's event, and what makes a podcast worthy of media attention, and, if those two things are connected. Along the way, I'm hoping that we'll hear about what to do and what not to do to get coverage for your podcast. So we're delighted to have Fiona with us today. Fiona Sturges is a writer and interviewer specializing in popular culture and the arts. You may know her from her weekly column at the Financial Times, where she writes about podcasts. There's always a gem or two in there every week, so do check it out if you haven't seen it. She also writes for The Guardian about arts and books, and she's a regular contributor to the iPaper and The Independent. Fiona's also appeared in a range of arts, culture, and news programs on BBC Radio 4, BBC 5 Live, and The World Service. Michaela Benson is professor in public sociology at Lancaster University, and she's the chief executive of the Sociological Review. She's a leading social scientist working on Brexit, migration, and citizenship, and she's particularly known for her research with British citizens living in the European Union. She's published a number of academic papers and books and has a portfolio that includes freelance writing for the BBC, The Telegraph, and various other publications in the UK, US, and Europe. And you may well know her from the fantastic podcast series, Who Do We Think We Are?, which is still running, and an earlier one, Brexit Brits Abroad. She is also project lead for our series, Uncommon Sense. I think that's everything from me. Don't forget, if you have some questions for Michaela and Fiona for the end of our session today, please put them in the chat box. And as I said, if you are running a podcast, participating in one, or you're planning one, please drop something into the chat box. Tell us about it. We would love to check it out. I'm going to disappear from the screen and leave our two speakers to proceed. Thank you again.
Thanks very much, Karen. And just a word of warning to everyone. In case I start coughing, sneezing, I do have quite a bad head cold. So that would explain that. So just bear with me if that does happen. I'm absolutely delighted to be hosting this second event for this week on podcasting for sociologists. And I want to start by adding to Karen's description of Fiona and her expertise, because when Fiona and I were doing our prep call, she described herself as a pair of professional ears, which I think is really, really important in terms of thinking about the role that journalists and critics might play in that landscape around podcasting. But Fiona, I wanted to come to you and just ask a kind of initial question, which is how you got into being, I think, a podcast critic is how you define yourself, and what that actually involves.
How did I get into it? I mean, blagging mostly. And I mean, it's a ridiculous job description, isn't it? I am a professional pair of ears. It's true that I am, amongst other things, but it's it sort of makes it sound like I just sort of loll around on the sofa with my pets listening to podcasts and having long naps, which isn't that far from the truth, but that is part of it. And how did I get into it? I have been a journalist for 25 years, and I started off in music journalism in the 90s. And after about 10 years of that, I sort of thought, I'm getting older, it's time to branch out, let the kids do the music stuff. And I moved into writing about books and radio, and I'd already been, doing a little bit of TV stuff and film criticism and this and that. And then basically I had a baby and thought, I don't really want to go out so much now. What can I do that will plant me on my sofa and I can call it work? And one of those things was reviewing books, and another thing was reviewing radio. And I had been offered the radio column at The Independent a few years earlier, and I was like, no, I'm not that old and pathetic yet. By this point, I was old and pathetic enough, and so I took on the radio column. And then that evolved really, as that was with The Independent, and I caught radio at a time when podcasting was sort of coming in a bit, but it wasn't a mainstream concern. So I sort of snuck, I found podcasting a lot more interesting than what was on the radio a lot of the time. So I started to sneak podcasts into this radio column. And then long story short, The Independent print edition shut down in 2016, and I moved over to the Financial Times just with that column. And because the Financial Times is international paper, it made more sense to make it purely about podcast, and because the podcasting industry had done what it had done, it made more sense to call it a podcast column. So that's where I'm at now. I've been doing that column since 2016, and at the very beginning of it, my editor, when I went for the first sort of proposal meeting, she said, yeah, but are you sure there's going to be enough podcasts to do this every single week? And I was like, yeah, I think so. And now, we're on 5 million podcasts out in the world. So there's definitely plenty to cover.
And you've listened to all 5 million of them,
I've listened to all of them, yes. From the episode, yes.
I wonder, there's something there in what you just said, which was to do with, finding podcasts more interesting. What was it about podcasts that you found more interesting than radio?
It's a funny question because it's an itchy topic as to what the difference between a radio program and a podcast is, and my husband and I are always arguing about it. I know best, obviously, but he's just like, I don't get it. What's the difference? But the difference is that the radio can act as wallpaper. It can be the background to your day. It can, radio punctuates the day with news bulletins and particular things happen at particular times. And very, very strict formats and fast moving, whereas podcasts are made for the listener to dwell on and to really take their time over, but also to they make the active choice. They search out a particular topic or a particular host or whatever it is that's got them there. They look, you make an active decision to discover a podcast, and with that, it means it is not wallpaper. It is something that you are directly engaging with, and that in turn affects how it is made and the kind of topics that are covered. And so it's more, it's more varied and it's more inclusive, I think, broadly. And it's more, the type of topics that are covered are more wide ranging and more voices. Radio 4 is still very white and middle class, whereas the podcasting world, unfortunately, it is rather going that way, but it has a far greater breadth of audience and people and creators and the kind of voices and topics that you come across.
That's really helpful in terms of kind of laying out those differences as you see them. And just to go back to that point, obviously you haven't listened to 5 million podcasts, but on a weekly basis, how many podcasts do you find yourself listening to, or how many episodes, I suppose?
That's a little bit how long is a piece of string, because some weeks I will drop to my knees and thank the gods of podcasting that I will come across a podcast that does 10-minute episodes, and they've done 2 so far, and I can write my entire column on that, purely because I'm always fighting with, I've got a strict listening queue, but if I tip my camera to this desk, I've also got the books problem. So I'm always fighting between the books coverage that I do, plus the TV reviewing that I do, plus the podcast. So it very much varies from week to week. But generally I go big on one particular series in a week. Sometimes if there is something, because it's not a really long podcast column, it's not like Miranda Sawyer's that's like over 1,000 words and she kind of dips between lots of things. This is a 450 word column every week. So to really get in depth, I try and stick with one podcast and perhaps another one that is sort of covering a similar terrain that I might mention in the last couple of sentences. So it's usually one podcast in depth a week, plus the ones that I try and just keep on top of, but I fail miserably. And it's the kind of curse and delight of, obviously, of being a critic. I mean, it's just a stupid job. I'd be doing this whether I was writing about it or not, I reckon. But it is the curse that you get really into something and you get very enthusiastic and you'll kind of become an evangelist for this particular thing, whether it's a book or a podcast or what, and then you write about it and then you move on, and then other people start discovering it a few weeks later because it's out in the world, and by which time I'm like, no, I'm past that now. So it's quite a job just keeping on top of it all.
But I suppose in that role, you have a kind of a unique insight into what's happening to podcasting. And you kind of already described a little bit about this kind of explosion from 2016 until now in terms of the volume of podcasts that are out there. But I wondered if you could describe a little bit for us what the industry, I suppose, or the landscape of podcasting is today.
Well, it's quite different today even than how it was 3 years ago and 3 years before that and 3 years before that. It used to be, even when I started the column, it was quite a niche thing. So that was 2016. That was still post Serial. Serial was the big sort of, explosion that happened that made a lot of people, that was 2014, and made a lot of people begin to sort of go, we've heard of this podcast thing. I wonder what that is, because actually it had been around for 10 years before that, but people didn't really quite, the penny hadn't dropped at what the podcast was. Then 2014 Serial sort of blew it all up and made everyone think, oh well, could be a serious concern. We got a runaway hit, and podcasting had never had a runaway hit before then. It had a few sort of minor hits, but since that, at that point, 2014, 2015, 16, it was still there was not a lot of money in it. It wasn't a sort of mainstream proposition all over. And so it was seen as this kind of DIY medium where, and we'll get to this, I'm sure, later, anyone can do a podcast. You just need an internet connection and a crappy microphone and an idea, and off you jolly well go. Now that is still the case, but you're not going to get it. You're going to find it harder to build an audience because there's so much more competition. So, competition in many ways is a good thing because the quality of podcasts has increased. The budgets in particular, a big sort of networks like BBC or Wondery or PRX and Radiotopia, they have, you know, big budgets to spend on really, really decent narrative, beautifully made documentary podcasts. But it's a crowded industry now, and it's when I say crowded, I don't mean like there's too many podcasts. A lot of people will say that. Not true. There aren't too many. Well, apart from on my desk, there aren't too many books in the world. There aren't too many films in the world. You know, it's just we get used to this sort of weekly sort of rolling sort of content, if you like. But it is harder to get noticed. It is harder to do something unusual. It is harder to, while there are big budgets there, it's harder to actually find your way to snaffle those big budgets because you've got lots and lots of creators now, which you didn't have 5 years ago.
So that's definitely, captures some of the challenges that you might face as a podcast. But I suppose there's another side of this as well, which is, you've said it, that it's harder to find things. What do you think the challenges are for you as a journalist in terms of finding things versus, for example, if I go onto my phone, it will tell me, because you've listened to this, we think that you're going to like this, which is obviously like algorithmically produced. So I suppose that's a kind of another side of that landscape, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, and I think the algorithm, or the curse, or the blessing of the algorithm, however you see it, is not something that's specific to audio. It's there on your Spotify. It's there on on your on your TV streaming services, and how much you try and consciously dodge that or sidestep the algorithm and actually try and make your own judgments about what you want to listen to depends on how determined you are. And so I've got a 16-year-old daughter who I think probably she might be listening and come down and tell me I've got it all wrong, but I think she goes with the algorithm quite a lot of the time and does a lot of sort of listens or watches a little bit of something and then changes her mind very quickly and tries something else. That is not my experience, and it can't be, because I would be forever behind. My job is to tell people what is new broadly, or new or newsworthy. So I find out about podcasts partly because the podcast industry tells me, and I say that reservedly because they're really crap at telling me about new things. And the other way I do it is I put out fairly regular pleas on Twitter for creators to tell me about their new podcasts, stuff that's coming. My brain is usually thinking about 6 weeks ahead. So that's not where the listening is, but I'm thinking I need to, from week to week in the column, I need to have variety of voices, themes, formats. So what am I going to cover? And so I do rely on people to let me know on social media, or I'm not very forthcoming with my email because I don't want to get deluged, but to find a way to find my email, to send me stuff and tell me in advance of a podcast launching. But tell me if I'm getting ahead of myself here, but the industry itself isn't quite built. It hasn't quite got its head around the marketing of podcasts in order to help people like me. And I whine about that constantly, like the whole communication system of podcasting, it must be built around my schedule. But at the
obviously,
same time,
yes, or mine as a podcast producer, but
yes,
obviously
yes.
That would be great.
That would be great. But it's still, that I think, I know Miranda Sawyer, who she writes her column for The Observer. She has the same problem as me. We are working for newspapers, so we need to find out about things that are new. But quite often somebody will say, oh, I've got a new podcast. It started, where are we now? July. It started in January. And I'm like, that's not new.
Not new.
not remotely new. Or, I'm hitting my 150th episode. I'm like, don't care, sorry. If there is something topical in there, then maybe, but so for me, the way I discover podcasts is not going to have anything in common with your average punter. And I do kind of see that where members of the public, and podcast listeners, they will often recommend stuff for me on social media, and it's very lovely of them, but quite often it's the same, it's the Louis Theroux and it's the Adam Buxtons, and it's the same tried and tested hosts a lot of the time that they go back to, and they may have just discovered it and not know that the Adam Buxton podcast has been in existence since about 1852. But
before there were podcasts, there was Adam Buxton.
Podcasts, he was doing it, yes, and it's great. I have no problem with it at all, but not something that I'm going to cover because it's it's old news.
And it's quite interesting. The two people that you mentioned are, of course, white middle-class men. So
yes.
I think.
Yes.
So I think that we struggle with those issues regularly. But what I'm picking up from you in that kind of description is like there's something, and I'm going to use it as a hook to talk about what podcasts are not, because one of the big bugbears I have as an academic is that almost any audio content, whether it's the recording of an event, whether it's somebody's thoughts on X, Y, and Z, is being packaged up as a podcast. And I always feel a little bit, like, why don't you name it what it is, which is an event recording or something else? But I suppose what that kind of highlights is I can identify for myself, and obviously not my opinion is not necessarily the opinion that counts here, but I can identify for myself what a podcast is not. But actually describing what a podcast is, I was just wondering, because you're kind of talking about series there, aren't you? You're not talking about the one-off interview that somebody did with X, Y, and Z.
It's a tricky one. I don't think you would find two people that would entirely agree. But in terms of sort of technological terms, a podcast is an audio recording that goes online for lots of people to access. But in creative terms, that's not what it is. I mean, a podcast is, for me, something that's done with intent for a particular audience, for people who are going to find it, who have a particular interest in a particular thing. And what you're talking about of the people sort of bunging audio online is that's not a podcast, that's an afterthought. That's just how can we squeeze more content out of this thing that we've already done. I mean, bizarrely, when I started I mustn't badmouth my employer, but when I started at the Financial Times, they were doing a series, and they still are, and it's really great, called Life of a Song. And it's this written week-to-week feature where you tell the life of a song, a particular song that may have been covered by lots and lots of different artists over the years, and the story behind the song. And as I was starting the podcast column, they said, because I've been a music journalist, come write a few of those columns. So I did, and I wrote one about, I can't remember, Strange Fruit, that was it. And they said, come in, bring a transcript of your article and read it in our studio, and we'll put it out as a podcast. And I was just, I'm okay, I think, in terms of not being too flat and boring when I'm just talking normally. But if I'm just reading out an article that I've written, it's really hard to make it sound in any way sort of lively and charismatic. And I was just like, guys, that's not a podcast. But I couldn't shout too loud because I was new. They've stopped doing that. Their podcast sort of stable has evolved, and they're now winning prizes and doing brilliant work. But that is an example of what you're talking about. We've got this thing that we've already done. Let's just stick out an audio version of it and see if anyone's interested. And to me, on a creative level, that is not a podcast. That is just more unthought about content.
I suppose some of that goes to the kind of heart of questions about audience and intent, and how things, and I think you kind of hit the nail on the head a bit. I was listening to a podcast, something called a podcast. Well, I don't know whether they actually call it a podcast, a Guardian's long read, one of the Guardian's long reads, and thinking to myself, I'm sure this worked really well as an article, but it hasn't been written for a listener. It hasn't been written for me to listen to this. And so it doesn't really work. It can't cross over in that respect from one to another. And that's not true of all of their long reads, but definitely some of them.
No, I agree with that. Although, I mean, but I do know that it's those audio things sort of serve a purpose for people who are on the move. The Guardian reads are really, really good. She says, writing, I write for the Guardian, hello, but they are very good. But no, they're not made for audio. And if you've got a reader who is not that great at it, then it's terrible. And then so sort of somewhere between this sort of, the Venn diagram of podcasts there, radio there, you've got audiobooks. And one thing I do at the Guardian is I do a weekly audio. I mean, this is why I've always got whatever I'm doing, I've always got some audio going on somewhere, because I do a weekly audiobook. And and there's a lot of confusion between what people are sending me in terms of, we've got this great thing for your podcast column and it looks to me like an audiobook, and then someone will say, we've got this great thing for your audiobook column and it looks to me more like a podcast. And then I end up getting a discussion with whoever it is who sent it, but is this really? And so there are overlaps between all these forms, and audiobooks in particular, what you're talking about is something that often is meant to be written, is meant for the page, and authors don't necessarily make great narrators. But every now and then you get an audiobook where you think this is actually brilliant for an audiobook and is really not as great on the page. So you're just thinking about, the point of this really is not the labels, but thinking about how stuff comes alive in audio, and where those overlaps kind of are.
That's really helpful, and I think that's a really good tip. Yesterday we talked about scripting in the session, and kind of writing for audio rather than writing for the written page, and I think that's so really holding up that sense of difference.
One thing that I would just mention in there is a lot of podcasts, not all, but a lot of podcasts, particularly the ones with lots of money and lots of people to do the admin for them, now publish transcripts of their podcast. Yeah. And if you take those transcripts and put it next to a Guardian long read or an excerpt from a novel, you can just see from looking at the transcript how this works as an audio proposition that is purely for the ears, not the eyes, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, definitely. So that's all been really, really helpful in kind of setting up some of the kind of the premises around what podcasting is and isn't. But I suppose what would be helpful to hear from you is what the role of journalists is in what is, as you kind of described it, a slightly chaotic, slightly underdeveloped infrastructure around podcasting. What role do you think they can or do play, I suppose?
Journalists, you mean? Yeah. What, in terms of the service we provide to listeners? Yeah,
where do you sit within that chaotic structure, I suppose? Well, or what are you trying to do, I suppose?
I'm just like a massive funneling service of stuff, of books and podcasts and whatever else. But with pods in particular, there are 5 million podcasts, and for the average person that might, listen to, let me think, a podcast a month, maybe if we're thinking of people's habits, I know they've changed since the pandemic, but if you're thinking of, podcast producers used to think about the morning commute, so how much time somebody would spend with a podcast in a week. So let's say that you're listening to a podcast a week, then where do you go to work out what to listen to? And so my job is essentially, I hate breaking it down this basically, because it's so basic. It's just listen to this, but don't listen to that. That's what I'm doing. But at the same time, as I hopefully, if I'm doing my job properly, I'm providing a kind of consumer service, like the Witch magazine of podcasts in some ways, but while reflecting hopefully on the certain sort of tics and habits and tropes or the sort of groundbreaking and surprising advances in the form. That makes it sound very lofty. It's not that lofty, but it's all hopefully knitted in there. So I've just written this morning. I sent it in a review of Agatha Christie and the Dandelion Poisoner, which is a new podcast that's coming out on Audible today, in fact. And so it is a sort of lovely, cozy old, in some ways, old podcast about the murder mystery kind of business in the time of Agatha Christie, and a particular case of the Dandelion Poisoner. I won't go into the story, but I was quite surprised listening to it that in the middle of it, at a time when I like to think that kind of podcasting has evolved and become more aware of how they treat dead women, right in the middle of this podcast, it is really good. So I'm not dissing the whole thing. The host was reading out what happened during an autopsy, and it was kind of done in a slightly sort of comic way, and the producer had seen fit to introduce sound effects to this autopsy. And I just, for me, underlining a bit, going, this is a good podcast, but why are we still doing this? Why are we still sort of getting this lip smacking tone over dead women's bodies, you know. So it's sort of picking out certain themes and habits and you know, as I said, the great things, the format sort of the great ideas that you get in audio but that perhaps you don't get elsewhere.
I think that's I think that's really useful, because I think often when we think about audio, we might just be thinking about what is somebody saying, but there's also so much other stuff that's going on in a podcast, often around sound design, sound quality.
Yes.
You put that content together and how you make the content animated that we might overlook. And of course, those all have budgetary considerations as well as.
And this is like an audible production. It's really, you know, it's a glistening production. It's just I felt just in this moment they got the tone really wrong. But I wouldn't, I mean, there are many worse examples of podcasts that do that and still do that. And mostly I get sent a lot of true crime, like, I mean, probably
there's so much of it. So much of it.
Series, yeah, print a new series every week. And if I just see, you know, dead woman, I'm like, no. In fact, if I see dead anybody, I'm quite into the true crime where there are no corpses and it might be a kind of art world heist or, you know, something else where I don't want to hear any more about. And that's, I suppose that's my job. I hear more than most people. So I'm noticing trends that if you're, you know, the average listener may not pick up on. So, you know, so another thing that I try to avoid, and I'm just going to, you know, say in advance here, not trying to insult anybody listening who is actually making a podcast with a series of you know, an interview podcast, because that is the most common format where you have, you know, you have a particular subject, you have a host and they bring on a new guest each week for 12 episodes, and then the podcast stops for a while, and then you get next season and it's another 12 episodes all interviewing different guests. That has a, you know, that is the default format for podcasts, and it has great value. But as a writer trying to, and a sort of consumer trying to look for new ways to tell stories, I'm just like, we've got another podcast and it's just a load of celebrity guests. Or I mean, it's particularly if it's celebrities that it annoys me. And someone sent me a pitch for one just last night, and she said something guests, food, and I thought, oh, food, that's not done so much in podcasts. I'm going to look at this. Oh, you've got a series of guests. Then a couple of days later, she followed up and she said, by the way, all our guests are refugees. And I'm like, okay, because I was thinking celebrity guests. That puts a whole new, this isn't out yet, so I'm not going to tell you what it's called, and in fact I can't remember, but it puts a whole new tint on it. Okay, so you're talking to people who've been through something traumatic, who are sort of excavating memories through 5 dishes in each episode. That's an interesting idea. The let's talk about food with a load of celebrity guests. Well, we know that Grace Dent's doing that one very well, so we don't need really any more of those. So I'm always looking for that new format, or that sort of innovation and topics and voices that that aren't so common.
I think that's really helpful, and I suppose it's like what sparks your interest is really important there. But I suppose the other side of this is it's a horrible word, isn't it? It's about discoverability, and I mean, I think, you know, I've learned a lot about this in consequence of having hosted and produced my own podcast over the last 6 years, because you have to spend a lot of time both building your audience and building your brand, which is something that probably, you know, I'm saying that and I'm cringing slightly, because I know that most of the people in this webinar are academics, and you know, it's not something that comes naturally to us. It's not something that we're trained in. But yet, in order to, for example, if you're producing a podcast the way you want to reach a more general audience rather than an audience of your peers, there's nothing wrong with producing a podcast that is just for academics. But if we're using it as a way of doing public engagement, then we do, to a more or less degree, have to engage with that project of audience building and brand building. But some of that is about being discovered. And I kind of like, in my head, I'd like to be able to like throw something out in the wild and then just leave it to make its own way in the world. But I know that that is not going to help me achieve the ends that I'm going to do, that I'm seeking. So what is it that you do to find podcasts, or what is it that podcasters do to find you, I suppose? rather than, you know, because you're not stumbling across podcasts in the wild, I assume.
No, not often. I mean, one of the things that, I mentioned earlier about talking to people on social media about their podcasts, and providing they're not telling me that I'm on, you know, episode 50, please will you write about my podcast. I kind of love that I can sidestep the PR industry or the sort of gatekeepers, and I can just ask people, what podcasts have you got coming up? I usually in my Twitter say, you know, what I'm looking for is podcasts coming out in September. I'm looking for podcasts that are doing something interesting and innovative with the form. And I generally say, please no, and the list isn't too long, but please no wellness podcasts, please no celebrity interview podcasts, and, you know, a few other things that are getting on my nerves at that particular point. And you know, so I can dodge the gatekeepers. I think people who are, you know, just listen to a lot of podcasts and want to discover stuff not through the algorithms will often do the same thing, because on my, you know, I follow far too many people on Twitter, so I don't and never know what's going on, and I miss a lot of stuff. But people are always saying, I'm just about to go on a long train journey. Has anyone got any good podcasts? All the time. So that kind of word of mouth thing is really, really valuable, because a lot of people don't trust or particularly just like the algorithm. And the other way to do it is through press. And you know, that's me, obviously, but that's also, there are other podcast critics. And, you know, podcast criticism is in some ways lagging behind other types of criticism, because it's a newer form. But, you know, we used to magazines and newspapers having a dedicated film critic, and that dedicated film critic will produce 5 reviews, you know, everything that's out on a Friday. And it will run, you know, the reviews will run on a Friday, and those films will be in the cinemas or on your streaming platforms over the weekend. So that's where you find it. I'm trying to kind of, you know, that has been the same since as long as I've been in journalism, in 25 years, and, you know, a lot longer. But people are not, the mechanism around the podcasting industry is not sort of built for that. And yes, I am working within a newspaper which has those strictures, and so is Miranda, and so is James Marriott at the Times, and the Sarah Larson at the New Yorker, and Nick Qua on Vulture, and there are quite a few critics. There's not that many of us, but there are quite a few critics who are doing these sort of weekly recommendations, and the marketing around podcasts is not adapting to that at all. This sounds incredibly whiny, because I just want everyone to fit in with me, but it's also, you know, you're thinking about your listeners as well. Now, podcasters, and I suspect there'll be lots of people listening to this who do this, do work by the seat of their pants, you know, that so
yeah.
I mean, I'm a deadline junkie. I know exactly about working by the seat of your pants, but it doesn't leave any time for marketing if you're making your podcast and then you're just whacking it out there and and then you start your marketing when it's already there. How can you possibly build up that sort of necessary sense of anticipation, that head of steam? How can you know, expect the press to sort of leap into action when you don't give the press any advance warning? So I'm going to keep using the film analogy because I think it's important. I mean, we've just seen from Barbie and Oppenheimer, you know, a marketing sort of world in action. So all that, you know, pink shit that was going on with the Barbie side of things, and all the, you know, the more serious Oppenheimer stuff. I mean, you couldn't, even if you had no interest in film whatsoever, you couldn't have missed any of that in the last 2 months. And that the films only came out last weekend. So in that, I know it's a very extreme example, but in that kind of that preamble, you know, you are building up a sense of anticipation, so that when that weekend comes, that they open in the cinema, people are like, yes, I'm there for the opening night, or I'm there for the opening weekend. And you need a little bit of that with podcasting. And, you know, some series with a decent marketing budget can achieve that. there are weeks where me and James, and on the British side of things, when me, James at the Times, Miranda at the Observer, and I'm trying to think who else will, like the new Serial podcast, for instance, they're always quite on it, and they tell you about stuff like a month or 6 weeks in advance. And so probably last week, certainly my review of The Retrievals, which is the new Serial series, came out last week. So did Miranda's. So did, a lot of publicity arrived on the week that podcast came out, but that's so vanishingly rare. And so if you are just making your podcast right up to the wire, and then you're just dumping it out there at midnight on a Thursday morning, and then you start telling people about it, you're not going to get that proper marketing push. It just doesn't work. So you have to think about that way in advance. So what is this? And so then you tell journalists about it, but also you tell your audience, social media feed. You tell, if you're in an academic institution, you send out, a press release to your department or to all the departments of your particular school or whatever it is before you release it. So that
I think this is really interesting, because one of the things that's striking me is to do with the DIY-ness of podcasting, and thinking about this in respect to some of the things that you're saying there, which is to do with publicity and promotion. And of course, in other kind of cultural sectors, there are well-oiled machines around PR and around publicity, which you've described as actually slightly lacking in podcasting. I think that
slightly, but the BBC is doing this as well. It's not just the DIY podcasters. The BBC is it sends out its radio schedules. They've got a whole dedicated website to BBC Previews, which is TV and radio. And so if I want to know what's on the radio in 4 weeks,
that's where you have to go.
I can go into their portal and I can see exactly what's coming up. And quite a lot of the time I can access the audio as well, because they have to get it in place ahead, because they're working to a schedule. And I've really butted heads with the BBC over the absence of an equivalent for podcasting, and I started begging them, will you just at least put together a bloody newsletter so I can see what's coming up next month, rather than you tell me on the day it's dropped today. And it's like, well, guys, you are a well-oiled machine. How TV, you've got a whole infrastructure around TV and radio to tell journalists way in advance. So why isn't this happening here? Because if you tell me the new podcast, your great big expensive narrative series that you spent hundreds of thousands on and you've had in production for months and months and months, if you tell me it's dropped today, that I'm like, I've got a column to write on Thursday, and I've got something planned for that particular week, and I've probably got something planned for the 3 weeks after, and I've also got to balance from week to week what kind of subjects I cover, and also I can't, to please all territories, so I need some forward planning. So what I generally say to people, and I do have, this is such a common gripe for me, that I now have a cut and paste
response,
like a sticky note on the corner of my laptop, and it's just, please in future, it's really I've got it down now, please in future can you just give me, for forward planning purposes, I don't need the audio necessarily until that week, but I do need to know the information. But podcasters are very much accustomed to this idea of you're fully immersed in the work, and I do understand this. You're fully immersed in the work, and you want to get it right, and you want to get it beautiful, and then you put it out, and then you're like, ta-da! And then nobody's paying any attention, and it's because, well, you didn't tell anybody beforehand, did you?
I think that there's some parallels with academic publishing, to be honest, that probably are worth reflecting on here, but we don't have time to do that in terms of the kind of ta-da moment. But some of that is to do with those things actually having a longer tail to them in terms of discoverability and things like that. So we have a longer, we have expectations that the work that we do will contribute in the longer term, and maybe we need to think about how that plays out in respect to podcasting in that respect. But so you've told us a lot about what gets on your nerves, and I completely appreciate it. And I'm also like, actually, following the conversation that we had in preparation for this, I started to think about what was going wrong in respect to my running to a deadline kind of issues relating to my podcast. But what would you prefer to hear from people? What's your ideal way of someone communicating with you to attract your attention? And I suppose one thing that academics are familiar with potentially is press releases. Is that the best way of grabbing your attention? And what should that include?
It should just tell me when it's out. I mean, it's so simple. The shorter, the better, because I get, hundreds of emails on, from the particular industries every day. So most of them get deleted immediately without me even reading. Sorry, everyone, but they do. They get deleted without me reading them, because a lot of it's just sort of, a musician singles coming out and I don't care. Delete. But with a podcast, in the title is important. New podcast. Quite often I get, by the sort of bigger podcast networks, they send me episode. They like to send me a press release per episode. So I'm like, delete. Don't want to know about that. I want to know about a new series. That's just purely because I don't write listicles that that hinge on individual episodes so much. But it's in the title, new podcast. Hopefully your podcast has a title which tells you a little bit about what it's about. So for instance, last week, the podcast I wrote on last week for the BBC was not for the BBC, by the BBC, was called Yeti. So you don't really need to expand on that, do you? You kind of,
It's about the abominable snowman, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
you know what that's about. This new one that's coming out that have written on for next week, Agatha Christie and the Dandelion Poisoner. Okay, so my ears are pricked because the title is good. And it is worth very much thinking about your podcast title. It's got to be snappy, but it's got to tell the listener something about what's in there. Otherwise, I mean, the amount of podcasts I get now that are variations on the phrase or the words untold or unheard, or sort of that hint at voices that you don't normally hear, and then you have a look and you go, yeah, no, I've heard of all of those things. That's don't kidda. But also it's a bit sort of untold. It's just a bit vague. There are a lot of podcasts with those types of names that don't actually tell you about the podcast and what the general topic is. So the podcast name is important, getting that in the title, and then a press release. I'm on the side of short. I don't need an episode by episode breakdown necessarily. If you've got it, fine, put that, but at the top I need to know just a précis. What is your podcast about in 4 sentences? Maybe a few names, if it's got sort of names that I'm going to be interested in that are involved, maybe a few names. If it's, is curses, if it's a guest-based podcast, then yes, I want to know who the guests are, and the general topic, and absolutely at the top when it's coming out. And then sometimes, people who are really organized, but I don't expect this at all, because I know how podcasters work, the audio will be attached. But it's not crucial. Usually I want the information for forward planning purposes, so I can look at my calendar of what's coming up and think, oh, well, I'll do Agatha Christie then, I'll do the Yeti then, but maybe I need something a bit more political and sort of hard hitting between those two. And then, maybe that's 3 narrative podcasts in a row, so I need to do a sort of something where the format's mixed up somehow, maybe an audio drama could go in there if I must, and so on and so on. So that's when I talk about forward planning, that's what that's about. I need to be able to take a step back and get a balance. I also need to go to my editor and just let them know broadly what I'm planning, because if I'm about to do the Yeti podcast and they just happen for some reason to be running a huge piece on the Yeti, then we're not gonna, that's not gonna work. So all of that kind of forward planning has to be, and those conversations have to happen ahead of the podcast coming out. And I'm happy to sort of ask for more information, but the amount of press releases I get where it says, we're doing this podcast, and I don't know, it doesn't have a launch date, and I think it's already out, isn't it? And it's already been out for some time, hasn't it? But they haven't said. So I then have to email them, which is annoying, just adds to admin. When is this out? Oh, it's been out for 2 weeks. And I'm like, forget it then.
I think that's really, really interesting. I mean, it's like this classic thing, which is, what is the basic information that you need? And you've highlighted the dates, you've highlighted the kind of the so what and how it's going to catch your attention, but also the format, which is important.
Yes.
And I wanted to go back to something that you said before. You said that most podcasts are interview based, and actually that doesn't, I guess what that means is that it's quite difficult to find something original to say about a format in that respect. But what are the things that really get you going? What do you get really excited about when you hear it?
I love a podcast that goes outside. that goes outside into the world, you know, be it a nature program or there was one, I forget the name because I do forget the names very quickly, a podcast about Detroit. Actually, I don't forget the name. It's called Intersections : Detroit, and it was just it's a podcast about a sort of celebratory podcast about Detroit as a thriving city rather than a broken city.
Yeah.
And a lot of that podcast was, you know, it was a novel idea because it was countering the cliche, the particular, or not even a cliche, but a sense that an outsider might have a particular place or this particular subject, because it was saying, you know, look at this, look at Detroit, as it's got this history, but from that has come, you know, a thriving community of creative people. But it also took you out onto the streets, and it sat on people's porches to talk to them, and it went into coffee shops, and it just listened to the traffic, and it listened to the hubbub. And it wasn't, I'm sure we'll come on to production values. You can have very good production values while actually allowing noises to intrude in some ways, because sometimes that intrusion of noise is wonderful. Another example of that is a podcast by Melissa Harrison, she did a podcast at the beginning of lockdown about her she's a nature writer, and she went out daily she must have started it was just at the tail end probably of the first lockdown in 2020, where and hers was a homespun, homemade podcast, and she just took a microphone out into her local village where there was nobody about, and she listened to the sounds of nature. And it was that, you know, as she did it day to day to day, the dawn chorus every morning. I mean, I'm not a big nature loon at all, but the dawn chorus was getting louder. There was one day that she sort of got up at 4 o'clock in the morning and basically sat in a hedge to listen to the birds waking up. And it was just lovely. It was just a fully kind of immersive moment, and a beautiful idea at a very particular time when we were all trapped indoors and feeling claustrophobic. It sort of countered that claustrophobia. It was wonderful. So when podcasts do get out into the world of people or nature or whatever, or there are sort of, you know, you can do sort of travelogue type things, or there's, you know, there was another podcast a few years ago now about someone who was suffering from mental illness, and she was actually, it was quite grim, but in a compelling way. She was recording just all day, every day, as she woke up and how she was sort of suffering. And it was very domestic. The scene was very domestic, even though the sound was good. And so those are the types of podcasts I really love, because they're not just thinking about, here's a topic, we will attack it by talking to a different person every week. I know that has its place, but here's a topic. Let's think about how we can make that fully immersive and atmospheric and really give a intimate experience of this particular thing by the use of sound.
Yeah, that intimacy came across yesterday a lot when we were talking about podcasting and what podcasting is, and how you prepare your audio, I suppose, for intimacy is really important. We're running really over time, unfortunately, but I'm going to go for another 5 minutes or so, and then I will get to the questions that are in the chat. But I suppose, you know, I'm kind of thinking here, like, so I'm going to put my cards on the table. When I first started podcasting back in 2017, I had very lofty ambitions, let's put it there, for how far the format would help things to travel. And that was with my Brexit podcast, which was called Brexit Brits Abroad, which found its way onto a listicle or two, I will admit, for podcasts about Brexit, and did have quite a good, I think, download base for what was essentially me chatting with a load of people about Brexit and what it meant for British people who lived in the EU, and, you know, various types of people. Yeah. But as I've kind of gone through my podcasting career, I suppose, I've started to think more critically about how we work with podcasts to break them out of a kind of, you know, I think that one had a public interest point to it. My current podcast, Who Do We Think We Are?, which is about debunking taken for granted understandings of migration and citizenship in Britain today. I think that probably the audience for that if I'm right, it's probably mostly academics and students and a few of my mum's friends, if I'm very, very honest, judging by some of the comments I get on Facebook from them. So apart from my mum's friends, I suppose, well, the question is not to do with how I move beyond my mum's friends, because I think actually that's probably quite an important audience for us to a certain degree. But I've obviously learned some of the rules of the game as I've worked through this, through trial and error. But is there any advice that you would particularly give to social scientists about moving into the space of podcasting where they're not familiar with the rules of the game, where they're not familiar with the structure of the industry, or how to even kind of approach finding an audience, finding someone to work with them to, you know, to promote their work or you know, catch your attention?
Well, I suppose it's about making your podcast accessible without making it stupid, if that makes sense. Because obviously, you know, if you're talking about a social sciences podcast, and, you know, I know nothing about social sciences, but if it just falls in that category, you're going to, you have to sort of package it up in a way that makes it seem like it's not too niche. A lot of podcasts are really niche, by the way. I mean, that's in some ways that is the glory of podcasts, that you can pretty much find an audience for anything. You know, there are podcasts about chameleon ownership, and there are podcasts about pens, and you know, just random shit. But you still have to do that, and you still have to present that podcast in a digestible and engaging way. And so, you know, not to stereotype academics at all, but just, you know, that I know that from when I was working briefly for a few years just teaching journalism in a university, and when I picked up academic books on journalism rather than the kind of stuff that, you know, I would normally read, I'd be sort of, you know, oh my God, this doesn't make it sound in any way fun. You know, a lot of the sort of vitality of what I feel like I do in terms of going out and meeting people and interviewing people and telling stories and all of that, just, you know, it was just seemed to have the joy sucked out of it. Now I know that that's not across the board, but you have to think very hard about, if you want to reach an audience beyond the people who already know about this subject and beyond the academics, then you've got to almost bring the clever stuff in by stealth. That does not mean that you're dumbing it down. It just means that you're teasing out the stories and the elements within it that are going to make the layperson's ears prick up and go, this sounds quite interesting. Now, you know, an example, I've got several examples of this, but I don't know how many people here listen to Radiolab, but the American sort of ostensibly a science podcast, which is sort of broadened out, but it's been around for, I don't know when it started, Radiolab in the late 2000s, and it's evolved, and it's huge and it's expensive, and they spend sometimes 2 years on a single episode, and it's an amazing kind of production now, and it covers, you know, history, politics, space, sex, biology, but it's all the stories it tells are underpinned by quite complex science. Now, I don't have a science or a mathematics. I mean, sometimes it's doing maths, and I'm like, I'm never going to listen to anything like that. But when I do, it's nearly always brilliant. And because what they do is they find the human stories within these topics, and then they will sort of they bring the science sort of around it and add it slowly, and they have lots of talking heads. And again, I stress, they have a ton of money to make this podcast a beautiful thing, but it's still, you know, you take a podcast like that and you think, well, how are they telling this story? Another example, which more people may have listened to, is Things Fell Apart, the John Ronson radio series. It's on Radio 4, but it is a podcast, and John Ronson is a podcaster, and he makes it for the podcast audience, not for the passing trade of radio. And, you know, he's telling stories about the culture wars there, but he's also telling quite complex political stories. But the thing that he does, you know, these are lightning rod topics. So on one hand, these lightning rod topics about, you know, trans politics, or, you know, race, or whatever it is, are you know, interesting in sort of social media sort of lightning rods, but they're still complex. But what he does is he sort of chases down the roots of these stories, or the roots of these conversations, these complicated, emotive, like, you know, anger-making conversations, and he chases down the roots of them to, you know, sometimes decades ago, and he finds out the stories of where they started. And I would say that if you were doing a bit of research and you're thinking about how to make your podcast digestible to me, let's just say it's me, because I'm a thicko and I don't know much about science and I don't know much about maths, but I'm not totally stupid that I can absorb and get my head around things if it's told in a certain way. But I would say do go to those particular podcasts and notice how you're doing it, in the same way that, you know, when I was teaching journalism students, I was like, you have to read. You can't become a journalist, or you can't become a novelist in a vacuum. You need to have read a lot to understand what the tropes are, what the you know, unsuccessful elements of it are, what are the cliches. And it's the same with podcasting. So you can't just go, it is supposedly this very democratic format where anyone can do it. Well, you know, my response to that is not everyone should do it, because, you know, skills. But
I suppose what you're advocating is also that, you know, it's like, I mean, when we were doing the prep call, and actually it came up with our other guest as well yesterday, about Katie Price and launching her new podcast, a celebrity launching a new podcast. And when she's asked, you know, what podcast she listens to, she basically acknowledges that she never listens to podcasts, but that's absolutely the wrong thing to do, right? So
yes, she did that at the podcast sort of fair thing in Angel, and, you know, bless her for being so totally upfront about it. But I mean, she is a symptom of the you know, a particular tranche of podcasts that are hosted by famous people who do not have the skills to do it. Now, maybe she'll make a great success of it. Gemma Collins, another reality TV star, actually her podcast is delightful in many ways. She's just, you know, no filters, she's quite funny. But, you know, as with anything, you have, there's a craft. It's not just something that anyone can do. Anyone can do it and put it out there, but if you want to be heard and you want to do it well, then you have to put the hours in. It's, you know, it's meant to be difficult, you know, in the same way no one would say, oh, I quite fancy making a film, you know, I'll just take my iPad. You don't do that.
Well, some people do, but yeah, no.
Successfully. So
I mean, but for the purposes of academics, academics who are used to doing research, what you're saying is do your research before you commit.
And listen. It's listening critically rather than listening passively.
Yeah.
In the same way that you read critically and you note, you know, when I'm reading books and I'm reviewing books, I'm looking at the structures and the tricks and the, you know, what the writer, the mechanisms that the writer is sort of deploying to propel this story forward. And, you know, and I'm doing that when I'm listening to podcasts, but if you're making it, that is crucial. What is John Ronson doing in Things Fell Apart? What is the structure? I mean, break one of those episodes down to see how complicated it is. He said to me, that he felt like a miniaturist building that series and building any of his series, because he's, you know, he's sort of building this really complex doll's house, and he's just put it, the detail and the care and the love that goes into every minute of that audio. And it's the same with Radiolab. Of course, he's got the resources and the skills and the massive production teams to do it, sure, but to sort of, when you don't do that now, because we've got to that stage in podcasting when there are so many and there's so much competition, you can't afford to be sloppy. You can't afford to go, this will do. But though obviously a lot of people do exactly that. And generally I tend to write, you know, if I come across one of those that is worth writing about and it sounds very much this will do, then I'll say so. One example is the Anna Delvey podcast, which came out last month. Anna Delvey being the pretend heiress from New York who was jailed for conning a lot of people out of a lot of money. And there's been a Netflix series about her, so she's quite a well-known name now. So as soon as she came out of jail, obviously a podcast network approached her and said, how about a podcast, Anna? And she went, yes. And then she made one, you know.
Isn't the irony though that the first thing was actually a radio series and then it wasn't it was a podcast that sort of told the story, which was then picked up by Netflix, and then they come back to her when she's released. And I've never met anyone who just doesn't know what to do in front of a microphone. I mean, it's just the first episode. I would honestly I recommend it to people to see how bad
a really
not to
bad
do.
podcast can be. Yeah.
I think we should probably hand over to some questions, but perhaps towards the end, I'll come back to you again as well, Fiona, to ask what people should do to get started. But let's get some of the questions before we do that. So Verity's asked a question here, which is, you know, as a new podcaster, would it be better to record a series of podcasts and then release once the series has been finished so you can supply a consistent feed? Or would record and release work better and be more consistent with the ethos of podcasting? What do you reckon?
It depends what you think the ethos of podcasting is. I mean, if you think it's just sort of, you know, the seat of the pants thing that I was talking about beforehand, I don't think that ethos really holds up anymore, even if it was an ethos, because people like, you know, consumers, I mean, listeners, people like a bit of structure, and also the podcasts that, I mean, quite a few of them do this, actually, including Radiolab, but the podcasts that just run and run and run and run and run, I find it's hard to maintain, unless you've got the big bucks or the big names, it's very hard to maintain a momentum and keep the quality consistent. Whereas if you release in seasons, you're sort of, people aren't overwhelmed. You know, a 10 part This Things Fell Apart John Ronson podcast is just like great. You know, you might at the beginning of your weekend, you might just go, been really looking forward to that. In the same way that the Netflix dump, or let's not do Netflix because most of that's rubbish, but the Disney or the Now TV dump of a series, and you're thinking, you kind of, you know, you're looking forward to it, and partly because there's an end point. And I think the endlessly running podcast with no particular schedule has had its day, if indeed it even had one in the first place. I found it frustrating from the off. So seasons are good.
That's really good. That's really useful to know. And you'd be happy to hear from people about new seasons. It was also something that I picked up. So as somebody halfway through a season at the moment, I will keep in mind next season. There's a comment in the chat, which is about kind of the transferability, I suppose, of skills from having produced video or audio lectures for students during COVID. And what I suppose what the transition would be towards thinking about putting together a podcast, or what you might need to do to develop those skills. And I suppose the point is that during COVID, we started to move towards new technologies with our teaching. And obviously a lot of us learned that there were different challenges, you know, to when you're not face-to-face with students lecturing. Some of which I think might translate into podcasting, but I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that. It might be.
I don't know, because it slightly goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is you know, what you're calling a podcast. If you're talking about putting a lecture online so that students can use it as a resource, if I'm understanding that correctly, that's not the same as a podcast. That's just a lecture online.
I think more to do with the skills that might have been involved with that and how those might translate into a future podcasting project.
I don't see that leap being particularly inevitable, but, you know, I suppose a lecture, I mean, is a performance of sorts, isn't it? And certainly there's a very, as you probably found out over lockdown, it's a very different thing when you're sitting in a room full of students and they're either sitting there visibly snoring in front of you and being quite or they are, you know, you it's like being a comedian. You're working off the room, you know, you're working off the atmosphere, and sometimes, you know, discussions get a bit lively, and sometimes it's just, well, this is the difficult part of this particular module, and yeah, well, let's just get through it. And it's not so lively. But when you don't have that audience, it does take something away, because you're just sort of sending stuff out into, it's a performance
into the abyss.
It's just a bit weird. But, you know, I think when you're making a podcast, you've got to have sort of moved beyond those concerns, and you've got to be confident in your ability to convey. I mean, and that's why a lot of people end up, a lot of sort of, this sounds rude, but amateur podcasters will sort of use that default host and guest thing, because just talking into a microphone for 45 minutes at nobody in particular is really hard. Whereas if you've got a guest and you've got an exchange going on, then you cover those topics in a more lively fashion, because it is a conversation with all the sort of inflection and passion and, you know, whatever that goes with that. But I don't think it's just automatic if you're able to do a sort of fairly charismatic lecture online, that automatically makes you a podcaster, because there are so many more kind of elements to it than that. It's got to be, you know, you can afford to be, is it okay to say you can afford to be a bit sort of winging it with students? You can't wing it with, I mean, if you know your topic, right, you don't have to have it all down on paper. You're just like, well, today I'm going to talk about X, Y, and Z, and you can generally do it. That is very different to a podcast where people are listening much more intently and critically.
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, I was thinking about this yesterday as well, which is, yes, to a certain extent, there are some skills that you could, move across. So the skills around performance, intonation, all of those kinds of things. But there is a big difference, and it is to do with the audience, which is that at least you know that the students, they might not want to be there, but they assume that you know something. They already come in with that understanding, right? I'm being very careful with my words. Whereas actually you may be trying to persuade people to come along on your journey on a podcast in a way that, you know, we do that a little bit with students in the classroom, but they come in at a slightly different level to, you know, trying to capture members of the general public who might just be interested in what you've got to do. And I think that those kind of questions about authority and the assumptions around authority might be important to reflect on there in terms of thinking about who you're trying to target. And I would stress again, you know, irrespective of whether you're trying to get a journalist interested in your podcast, you do need to think about who you're trying to reach through your podcast.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important point.
That authority question is quite interesting, because you can be an authority on a particular topic, and that is implicit in the classroom, and it may be implicit on an online environment, but you may be absolutely terrible at performing in the way that is required. You know, as you will know, some lecturers are really animated and brilliant and have a sort of natural charisma that real students in, and some academics really don't. And, you know, not everybody has that. I remember years ago when I was very, very new to journalism, I did my first radio sort of appearance talking about something, but it was pre-recorded, it wasn't live, so it didn't have that natural sort of question answer thing, inflection going on. And somebody told me to read to whatever I was reading, to talk a bit like a children's presenter, or if I was reading a children's book to a child, to slightly exaggerate the intonation in my voice to make it. And I've never forgotten that, because then I did later on sort of notice when people, if you ever listen to Thought for the Day on the radio, on Radio 4, on the Today program, they are the people who've never heard that piece of advice, and they're just they're just reading from a piece of paper.
I was wondering what you were going to say there.
It is nearly awful. It is nearly always awful, or just flat, or just, I mean, it's bad. Not that this is the topic, but it's bad enough that thing exists in the first place. But they have people who deliver it in such a flat way that you just think, why are you asking them back? But you know,
but I suppose some of that is to do with like the kind of difference between lecturing and podcasting is to do with, as you pointed out before, where the audience is. And I suppose there's a difference, like, you know, as you described, you get that feedback when you're in the lecture theatre, at least, and that then leads you to modulate what you're saying and how you're saying it. Whereas most podcasts are not live. So you're not presenting that work in front of the audience. There's that time lag to the audience, and that in itself creates quite different conditions around production and what you need to do. And I suppose it's learning how to do that. I mean, I do write in my scripts, you know, I do punctuation to help me to do intonation at particular points.
Yes.
Which
it's both a kind of, it's a blessing and a curse, really, because as you're not doing podcasts live, you can go back and you can try again, in the way that with live radio you just have to sort of, you know, plow on regardless of what's happening. But yes, when you can't see the audience, you have to take a kind of imaginative leap. That's not only it's not an audience, it's an individual So what you are doing is you're talking to somebody who's generally got headphones in. I think I'm actually the only podcast listener that doesn't use her phone ever, but most people do. So you are inside somebody's ears, which is just mad when you think about it. So it is so intimate, but it means that they pick up on every nuance or lack of nuance. So it's an interesting one. And you know, if you screw up on radio, it's gone. I mean, apart from the radios that are put up, the radio programs that are put out as podcasts, but generally it's gone. But with a podcast, you do have to be, you know, I go back to John Ronson and his miniaturist comment. It's taking it to extremes, obviously, but you know, the level of production needs to be really good, because you are in somebody's, you know, you are talking inside their head. I
really feel very strongly about that. I think I mentioned when we were speaking before, I have hypersensitivity with my hearing. And I do listen to podcasts in my ears with headphones most of the time, normally noise cancelling ones, which makes it even worse when, for example, which is what happened to me the other week, the academic podcast that I was listening to, and it was an academic podcast, they had not turned off their phones, turned off the notifications on their phones or anything like this. And this is produced by quite a big outfit in academic terms. And so there were the noises of a phone charging, you know, when you plug your phone in repeatedly for some reason, I have no idea why, emails coming in. And that wasn't, and what was even worse was the fact that the host was very evidently preoccupied by something. And sounded very, very bored in a way that wasn't matched by his social media account of the interview that he'd done. But it was that kind of thing, which was like, I don't know whether I want to listen to this again, because it was so bad from that point of view. But I think that leads me on to a kind of a final closing question for you, which is that we've got people here who haven't podcasted before. What would your advice be for people who want to get started with podcasting? What do you think the basics are in terms of what people should consider if that's what they're thinking about doing?
Know your audience, know what you want to talk about, but absolutely above all, everything else, get a producer. It's that simple now. In the olden days of about 2012, 13, when podcasting was a sort of, you know, in inverted commas, new idea, new medium, it seemed very charming. I think people thought it was very charming to do the kind of that DIY thing that we've been talking about, not just inexperienced people making podcasts, but people making podcasts in their living rooms with, you know, as you've talked about with noise, the irritation of sort of extraneous noise. And it was all a bit sort of rough and ready, and wasn't that lovely because it was so different to the hushed sort of tones that you get on Radio 4, and isn't, you know, it's all very spontaneous and brilliant. That moment, I mean, has passed, because podcasting has become, you know, there is competition there. There's nothing cute anymore about just having three bros sitting on the sofa eating crisps and drinking beer and laughing at each other's jokes. I know that those podcasts still exist and they're really bloody annoying, but you know, I think you have to go for that, not pristine sound, because as I've said, you know, you can work daily noise into a podcast in the most artful, beautiful way ever, but you need to think about people's listening experience, and a producer will help you, and the producer doesn't just help clean up the mess of noise, and you really want that. You want a kind of a producer to go in with a vacuum cleaner after you finish doing everything that you've done in recording and just take out the itchy bits. But you also need another pair of ears, that's preferably not me, that's saying, no, that doesn't work, or do you know that your tone is a bit off there, or it's got to be a kind of collaborative endeavor, but it's got to have somebody who knows, who has the equipment, who has the knowledge. I mean, I don't know how you do it. I wouldn't make a podcast because I don't know how to produce a podcast, but you need somebody who, you know, just if you're going to invest and spend any money on any of it, then
get a producer.
For sure. And you know, I think get a producer and listen to loads of podcasts before you start, to know what the pitfalls are, and to know where you can kind of make it work. You know, you can borrow, beg and steal ideas for sure, and then you'll know more about what the awful tropes and sort of tics and all the things that we don't like as a listener. You will know about those beforehand.
That's really, really good advice. And I can really recommend, you know, for the person who was asking about writing and I think it was Hannah, writing a podcast into a funding application, do have a chat with a producer before you even do that, because there are a whole variety of ways in which you can work with the producer. It doesn't have to be super, super costly. I know that Karen has just slipped a recommendation of our producer, Alice Block, into the chat. We, right from the outset, right from the beginning of deciding we wanted to do a podcast at Sociological Review, the podcast that became Uncommon Sense, we brought Alice on board to talk to us even about the kind of the design of the series, to develop the podcast brief and everything. So do consider working with a producer. And I have to say, although I talk about producing my own podcast, and I do also work with a producer who helps me to do that. And I've been working with her for 7 years now. So, I've learned so much along the way about what it means to podcast today from doing that. But Fiona, that's been absolutely fantastic. What a wide-ranging conversation on so many issues. And I think that's going to be really, really useful to both the people who've been here and to the people who will watch this back after the event. So a big thank you to you. And I'd also, before Karen cuts us all off, I'm going to say thank you to Karen. The idea behind this 2 event series was Karen's, and Karen's done all of the behind the scenes work to make it happen. So thank you very much, Karen. And also Danielle Galway, who's our events manager at the Sociological Review. And you can check out all our Sociological Review podcasts on the website. But thanks once again, Fiona. It's been fantastic speaking to you.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Bye, everyone.